They say every song has a story, every rhyme a beginning, something we once knew but forgot over time. In my village, no one could remember when the rhyme first started. It was just there, like the dust on the ground, woven into our childhood games. I heard it first when I was young, laughing as I skipped around with other children, repeating the words over and over. Willy, 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 oh. I'm in the kitchen cooking rice. Daddy in the parlor watching film. Children in the garden playing ball. Echo, that is the end of my story. A bike pause, change your style. Another one. Be like that. Be like that. But no one ever asked who Willy was. To us, it was just a chant, something to pass the time, the words holding no more meaning than a casual breeze. But as I grew older, something began to nag at me, a peculiar unease that settled in every time I heard the rhyme. The adults in the village discouraged us from singing it near sundown, and parents seemed to tense at the sound of it. Occasionally, they'd exchange worried glances, whispering warnings for us to leave that name alone. And although no one ever explained why, there were always whispers, strange tales that hinted at the dark origins of the rhyme and the shadow of a boy that lurked behind it. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. My grandmother was sitting by the fire, her eyes distant as if she could see something beyond the flames. She was one of the few elders who remembered the stories of the village, the old ones that others refused to speak of. So I asked her quietly, in a voice barely above a whisper, about Willy. Her gaze hardened, and for a long while she said nothing. She just stared into the flames. Finally, she leaned close to me, her voice so soft that it barely carried over the crackling fire. Willy wasn't always just a name, she said. Her tone, shadowed by memories should rather not revisit. Long ago, he was a real boy, but he was different. People whispered that he was gifted, that he could be everywhere at once, watching from places he couldn't possibly be. His mother would call him to her side, only to find him already standing there, his eyes fixed on her with that strange, distant gaze. His father would search the fields for him, only to see him at the edge of the forest, silent and still, just waiting. It was as if he existed in more than one place, slipping through the shadows, a silent watcher in a world that didn't quite understand him. My grandmother paused, looking over her shoulder as if Willy himself might be standing there, watching us. People began to avoid him, she continued. He was lonely, a child left on the fringes, neither fully seen nor fully forgotten. But he kept watching, his mother cooking, his father sitting, the children playing. And in time, people simply stopped noticing him altogether, as if he'd become part of the shadows, a presence that lingered but was never acknowledged. Then, one day, Willy vanished. They searched the village, calling his name into the darkness, but he was gone. For days, there was silence and emptiness that crept into every home. Then, just as they'd given up hope, someone heard it, a faint voice on the wind, singing,
Willy, 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 oh.
No one knew where it came from, only that it was followed by an uneasy stillness, a silence that seemed to seep into the very ground. The village changed after that night. Children began to claim they saw a shadow lurking in the garden while they played, watching them with hollow eyes. Some said they'd heard whispers, faint voices calling their names from places where no one stood. Then came the disappearances. Children would vanish, sometimes for days, and when they returned, they were different. Dazed, silent, their faces pale, as if they'd seen something from beyond their comprehension. They would sit alone, muttering to themselves, their voices barely audible. The only words they could remember were those of the rhyme, repeating it as if in a trance. By then, the rhyme had become a warning, a tale to frighten children, a reminder to respect the shadows that watched from beyond. But as time passed, the warning softened, and the rhyme returned to children's games. The memory of Willy and his eerie gaze faded into the past. Years later, when I was about 15, the memory of Willy's story came flooding back. It was a restless night, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I sat near the edge of the village with a group of friends, bored and eager for something to break the silence. Someone suggested we sing the old rhyme. I remembered my grandmother's warnings, the look in her eyes as she spoke of Willy. But I brushed it aside. It was just a song after all. So we began, our voices lifting into the night.
Willy, 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 yo. Mommy in the kitchen cooking rice. Daddy in the power watching film.
As we reached the line, children in the garden playing ball. A strange chill swept over us. The air grew dense, almost solid, and a thick silence descended. One so complete that even our breathing sounded too loud. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps moving through dry leaves. I turned, looking into the darkness, and that's when I saw him. A shadow stood at the edge of the garden, his form barely visible, his face hidden within the gloom, yet his eyes glowed faintly. An unnatural light piercing through the shadows. A name slipped from my lips, barely a whisper. Willy? The figure tilted its head, a jerking, unnatural motion that sent a wave of terror through me. Then, slowly, it raised a hand, pointing directly at us. Fear gripped us and we stumbled back, desperate to break free from his gaze. My heart pounded, my mind racing to recall the final lines of the rhyme. Trembling, I forced the words out. Change your style, another style. But as the words left my mouth, the shadow shifted, moving towards us with slow, deliberate steps. Then, in a voice like dry leaves scraping against each other, it finished the rhyme for me.
Be like that.
I don't remember much of what happened next. My friends told me I collapsed, my body seizing, my eyes open but unseeing. They carried me back to the village, where I lay in bed for days, feverish, haunted by visions of those glowing eyes. When I finally recovered, I was forever changed. My sleep was plagued by whispers, faint voices calling my name. Sometimes, I would wake to see a shadow standing at the edge of my room, just watching. And when I closed my eyes, the memory of his gaze would linger, like an imprint burned into my mind. The villagers began to avoid me after that, and I became like Willy, an outcast, a watcher from the shadows. And though I tried to forget, to bury the memories of that night, the rhyme remained, an echo that haunted me wherever I went. Now, in our village, no one sings the rhyme. It has become a forbidden song, a warning that lingers in the air, unspoken but understood. Parents teach their children to respect the shadows, to never speak of Willy or the rhyme that calls to him, especially after dusk. Even in daylight, the village feels his presence, a cold heaviness that sinks into the bones, whispering of things better left forgotten. But children are curious, and sometimes they don't understand what it means to fear the unseen. Some, drawn by tales of the Watcher, venture near the garden at night, daring each other to sing his rhyme, to summon Willy from the shadows. They laugh, mocking the old tales, pushing each other, their voices carrying into the stillness. Then they hear it, a faint, familiar tune, like a voice carried on the wind, echoing back to them. But this time, the rhyme is different, the words twisted, strange.
Willy, 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 oh. Mommy is crying, she's calling him back. Daddy in the corner, frozen and black. Children in him, daddy, you're losing their way. Follow the watcher, be led astray.
The children grow silent, the laughter slipping from their lips, and a new fear takes hold as they feel it. The faint rustle of something moving just beyond their sight. Years passed, and although I avoided the rhyme, I could never escape the memories of that night. The image of Willy's shadowed figure and those glowing eyes haunted me. The village was no longer my home. People would look away when I passed, their expressions shadowed by distrust. They called me the cursed one, the child who had looked into Willy's eyes and returned to tell of it. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt it, the presence that had haunted my sleep for years. A soft, familiar tune drifted into the room, faint but distinct, echoing from beyond the walls. I sat up, my heart racing, and there he was, standing at the edge of my bed, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "Willy?" I whispered, my voice a cracked echo of the boy who had once chanted his name with innocence. He said nothing, just watched, his gaze as empty and unfeeling as it had been all those years ago. Then, in a voice that sounded like dead leaves scraping across stone, he spoke words that were as much a curse as they were a command.
Come with me.
Something gripped me then, a force that drew me from my bed, pulling me towards the doorway. My feet moved of their own accord, following Willy as he drifted towards the garden, his form barely visible in the dim light. The world around me felt warped, as if I were moving through water, every step weighed down by an unseen heaviness. As we reached the edge of the garden, I realized with a start that I could see others, shadows that lingered in the darkness, each one marked by the faint hollow glow of eyes. They stood scattered around the garden, their faces frozen in silent screams, the marks of those who had sung the rhyme and fallen under Willy's gaze. I tried to turn, to run, but my body was no longer my own. Willy turned towards me, his eyes narrowing, and I felt something cold and heavy slip into my mind. a darkness so complete that it felt like sinking into a bottomless void. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was his hand reaching towards me, his fingers stretching out to pull me into the shadows. I don't know how long I lingered there, trapped between worlds, a mind, a fragmented maze of fear and half-formed memories. But when I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the garden. I stood in the village square, alone and disoriented, the faint light of dawn casting long shadows across the ground. I returned to my home, to a village that looked at me with the same fear and mistrust they had shown to Willy all those years ago. I was now the outsider, the one who had been marked by the Watcher. And as I walked through the village, I heard it, a faint, familiar tune, drifting on the wind, the voices of children laughing and chanting.
Willy, 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 Willy.
They were playing again, singing the rhyme that had haunted my life, oblivious to the shadows that lingered, waiting for one of them to sleep. I wanted to scream, to warn them, but no sound escaped my lips, and in that moment I understood. I had become like Willy, a shadow bound to the rhyme, a watcher who could only wait and watch as the curse unfolded anew. And as I faded into the darkness, I knew that as long as the rhyme lived, so would I, a silent watcher beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the next child to summon me. So if you ever hear it, if you ever hear that faint sound of the wind calling you to the garden, do not sing, do not answer, for once you finish the rhyme, you will be marked, and Willy will be watching, always waiting, just beyond the edge of the light.
Willy, 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 oh. Mommy in the kitchen cooking rice. Daddy in the parlor watching film. Children in the garden playing ball. Echo, that is the end of my story. My back pause, change your style. Another one. Be like that. Be like that.